And I want to start out this morning, and I want to congratulate and welcome my good friend Steve Cohen as ranking member. I often remind him that he used to represent my sister, who then moved to an adjacent district to get better representation. Now, seriously, Congressman Cohen and I have had the opportunity to work together on a number of initiatives and travel together over the years, and a good friend, and looking forward to working together with you this year. Ask unanimous consent that the chairman be authorized to declare recess at any time during today's hearing without objection. So ordered. Also ask unanimous consent that all members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and ask questions without objection. So ordered. As a reminder, if members want to insert a document to the record, please also email it to documentsti@mail.house.gov. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. It's no secret that aviation is at a pivotal moment in history. Advancements in technology and innovation in aircraft design have not just made aviation or air travel safer, but it's also lowered the threshold or allowed more Americans than ever to be able to, given the opportunity to experience flight. The aviation sector wouldn't be where it is today without the general aviation sector. Just last night, led a night tour, and I think it was in the Rotunda around midnight, looking up at the frieze over the west front, the little fresco or what have you that goes around the rim of the Rotunda. And it begins with a depiction of Christopher Columbus coming off the boat and discovering the New World, and it goes around and it ends with the Wright brothers' discovery of flight. And it's such an important part of America's history that it's actually depicted right there in the Capitol, in the Rotunda. To see how far we've come over that period of time is remarkable, and what's even more exciting is that we've not fallen flat, not even close. Advancements in innovation are ushering in new users and use cases for the National Airspace System, including eVTOL, or electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft and drones. I'm excited to witness in real time the safe integration of these new technologies, these new entrants, and I'm excited to learn more from our witnesses about how Congress can bridge any gaps to achieve the shared goal of moving forward on Americans' leadership in aviation. We have the opportunity in the upcoming FAA bill to examine the challenges the general aviation community faces and address many challenges as we can put general aviation on sound footing for many, many years to come. And we need to capitalize on this opportunity. I worry that kicking the can until the next reauthorization bill will set back American global leadership in aviation. The time is now that we make smart investments in general aviation. We also have to ensure that all areas of the federal government are supporting our GA community. I've been excited to work with the Livingston Parish Airport District as they move forward to create a new GA facility in our district. But while the airport has received commitment and funding from our state and locals through COVID response, I do have to say the Treasury Department has been a complete pain and given us the Heisman for months and months as we try and get confirmation on the eligible use of funds for support for mitigation and other uses for the airport. GA facilities are an incredible asset in our district, and I'd like to take this opportunity to ask the Treasury Department, return our phone calls and emails, please. I look forward to working with the full committee chairman and members of the subcommittee in this effort. I now recognize Ranking Member Cohen for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It is a pleasure to be here and as ranking member and to serve with you. You are my friend. And in spite of the fact that in Memphis we put our refuse in the river and send it downstream and it goes to Baton Rouge.
Rodney Davis Jr.
I've never had the opportunity to sit next to a former governor, a present governor, or a future governor, so it's a great honor. That freeze he talked about, if they did it in 1969 or 1972, would have stopped with FedEx. So it would have continued on in aviation and great moments. As we kick off our first aviation subcommittee hearing and continue our efforts to reauthorize the FAA, I welcome this opportunity to discuss the challenges facing general aviation community. As we've heard from our chairman of our subcommittee, and we'll hear from our chairman of our full committee, Mr. Graves, our FAA reauthorization bill will be the first ever general aviation title. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on ways our committee can work with Mr. Graves, the first, on these important issues. General aviation is an important sector of our aviation system, spanning from sport and recreational aviation to medical transport to business travel to aerial firefighting and more. According to the FAA, the United States has the largest and most diverse general aviation community in the world with more than 220,000 active aircraft. Moreover, general aviation supports over 1.2 million jobs and is estimated to generate nearly $250 billion in economic output. It is encouraging that general aviation has become significantly safer over the past 4 decades, with the number of fatal and non-fatal accidents declining since 2000. When we held our hearing on this topic in July of 2022, I appreciated hearing from the National Safety Transportation Board Chief, Jennifer Hamady. As she noted, however, the vast majority of the NTSB's aviation investigations involve general aviation accidents, and this is because of the numbers, I guess, and the subsequent new regulations derived from their recommendations continue to contribute to improved aviation safety. Since 2000, the NTSB has issued 294 safety recommendations addressing issues related to non-commercial general aviation operations. Of the 296 recommendations, 231 have been closed, while 26 remain open. As we'll hear today, it's important that we all continue to work together to maintain the positive trend of general aviation and continue to increase safety for all of our general aviation users. I look forward to discussing ways in which we can continue to work together to transition towards an unleaded future. Aviation gasoline, or avgas, remains one of the only transportation fuels in the United States to contain lead, with more than 222,600 registered piston engine aircraft that can operate it on this type of gas. The use of leaded gas continues to remain a significant public health concern. It's been well documented by medical institutions and the CDC and the Control and Prevention Unit that lead exposure in children can lead to increased cognitive performance, decreased cognitive performance. I must have had a little lead around me at some time, and potentially lead to long-term learning and behavioral problems. I certainly did have it. In the 2018 FAA Reauthorization Act, we directed the National Academy of Sciences to study aviation gasoline and how to transition away from it. In the 2021 report, the National Academies noted there's currently no singular certain solution to the aviation lead problem, and therefore a multi-path mitigation approach offers the greatest potential for tangible and sustained progress. I applaud current efforts to research and develop alternative fuels, such as the Eliminate Aviation Gasoline Lead Emissions, or the acronym EAGLE initiative, to recognize it and will take a collaborative effort to move forward to a safe transition towards unleaded fuel. As we'll hear today, there are several issues that need our attention as we work on our next FAA reauthorization bill. I look forward to working with the subcommittee, the full committee, particularly with my friend Gary Grayson, coming together with a bipartisan bill that helps America's flyers and passengers and everybody connected to aviation. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Cohen. Our next opening statement, I'm convinced, we were talking about the Wright brothers. If this guy had been around after I spent a little time in Tarkio at his hangar, I'm convinced that the Wright brothers' time frame would have been cut in half if he was involved in developing that plane. I yield 5 minutes to the chairman of the full committee, Sam Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. I think everybody's pretty much heard that I intend to do in the next FAA reauthorization a GA title. It'll be the first time that we've done that. And I fully believe, I'm looking forward to doing FAA reauthorization. I really am. We've got so many challenges out there when it comes to whether that's workforce or air traffic control or organization within the FAA, some certification issues, but regardless, I am looking forward to it. But there are basically 2 tracks through aviation or to get into the aviation industry, whether that's a mechanic or pilot, even air traffic control, but you can come up through the military or you can come up through general aviation. And my concern within this committee's purview is obviously general aviation, and it's the cornerstone of aviation. Everybody that pursues a career in aviation starts out as a GA pilot. That's just a fact, and they start out at that local airfield. And there's challenges throughout that. We have to make sure that we figure out how to break down those barriers to get young people involved and young people excited again. And there's a lot of challenges out there, expense being one of them. But it's incumbent upon us in general aviation to do everything we can to encourage those young people to choose a career in aviation. And that's something that we need to be thinking about and something that we need to do. I've said many times before that one of the worst things that happened when it comes to the FAA is when advocacy was removed from the mission statement. And That's absolutely a fact. We need more advocates within the FAA and throughout aviation than we do so many other things, whether that's inspectors or enforcement or whatever the case may be. We have to be good advocates, and we have to get these young people. So I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here. I'm looking forward to hearing the testimony, or reading through the testimony that's been provided, and this is our start to FAA reauthorization. And again, the GA community is going to be. We're going to put some serious focus on it, whether that's local airfields or again, pilot training. And our organizations that represent general aviation are vital to that. And I appreciate all the input that we've gotten from the stakeholders and everybody from all of the organizations. And again, look forward to the testimony. And thanks for allowing me the time, Mr. Chairman. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, another great friend, and also Mr. Larson. I want to congratulate you for your position and look forward to working with you on the FAA bill this year. Yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Washington.
Thank you, Chair Graves. I appreciate the opportunity, and Ranking Member Cohen, thanks for calling today, the hearing today on securing the future of general aviation. So in my home state of Washington and across the country, general aviation means good paying jobs, and it's part of a key to long-term economic growth. A recent study found the GA industry supported an estimated $247 billion in economic output and 1.2 million jobs in the U.S. in 2018. It seems we maybe want to update that now. In terms of fleet size, the active GA fleet is projected to increase from its 2021 level of more than 204,000 aircraft to 209,000 by 2042. This means more manufacturing, more maintenance, more flight crew training will be needed, resulting in opportunities for growth in communities with general aviation airports, and that, of course, means investing in the workforce and developing the future workforce in aviation. But first and foremost, we must continue to champion aviation safety. Over the past few decades, general aviation has become significantly safer, with the number of fatal and non-fatal accidents declining since 2000. However, there is still room for improvement in GA, which has the highest aviation accident rate within civil aviation. In 2021, the NTSB found that most aviation fatalities in 2020 took place during general aviation opportunities, where 332 people were killed, compared to 0 fatal accidents involving Part 121 air carriers in that same year. Would note the accident of the Mutiny Bay crash in my own district, killing 10 in the last year as an example of that. But with new technologies available for general aviation aircraft, the expansion of analytical tools to study safety trends and patterns and improve training, we can, will, and frankly, we should do better. As well, general aviation also improves equity and access to the national airspace system for people across the country. Many small and rural communities do not have access to commercial service airports or regularly scheduled air service. For instance, 82% of communities in Alaska are only accessible via air, yet only a handful have regularly scheduled commercial flights. General aviation and charter services provide these communities with lifelines to critical resources and services. To that end, Congress specifically targeted general aviation in the bipartisan infrastructure law, investing $500 million annually over 5 years for general aviation and non-primary airports, and $300 million for contract towers, creating jobs and increasing mobility. These types of investments are critical into ensuring that NAS is available to all people. Unfortunately, as the NAS expands, we have to be cognizant of consequences, and as the ranking member discussed already, with regards to leaded fuel, certain piston-powered general aviation aircraft still use avgas, which contains lead. So while general aviation is the only transportation mode still using leaded fuel, we have to ensure that transition to newly available unleaded alternatives is safe and thoughtful. To expedite this transition, the Eliminate Aviation Gasoline Lead Emissions, or EAGLE initiative, was launched in the last couple of years. This federal and industry initiative aims to transition GA completely to unleaded fuel by 2030. And the general aviation sector is also committed to addressing the industry's contributions to climate change. In recent years, the development of electric and hybrid-powered aircraft have been among the efforts to reduce carbon and noise emissions. For example, Arlington Municipal Airport in my hometown of Arlington, Washington, is home to Aviation, an aviation company which is developing the 9-seat all-electric Alice aircraft. GA is also working to adopt alternative fuel sources to reduce carbon emissions, such as development and distribution of SAF. To support the sustainable growth of general aviation sector, Congress must create a regulatory framework that prioritizes safety, invests in the necessary infrastructure, and helps to make our communities globally competitive well into the 2050s and beyond. So while the future of U.S. aviation remains bright, general aviation is part of that picture and still faces challenges that have to be addressed. And we have that opportunity working with the FAA reauthorization to work with GA to ensure that future remains bright. Finally, before I yield back, Mr. Chair, I do want to recognize representatives from the Colgan family who are here to continue their valiant and necessary effort to ensure continued safety in the national airspace. With that, I look forward to tackling these issues together with everyone here, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Larson. I would like to welcome our witnesses today and thank them for being here. Briefly, I'd like to take a moment to explain how our lighting system works to our witnesses. There are 3 lights in front of you. Green means go, yellow means you're running out of time, and red means wrap it up and conclude your remarks. I would ask unanimous consent that the witnesses' full statements be included in the record, and without objection, so ordered. As your written testimony has been made a part of the record, the subcommittee asks that you limit your oral remarks to 5 minutes. And with that, Mr. Baker, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Airline Owners and Pilots Association, you are recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Thank you. Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Cohen, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to provide the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association perspective on how to secure general aviation's future as you develop this year's FAA reauthorization. First, let me thank the committee and the professional staff for all the work and effort that goes into compiling such an important and comprehensive bill that impacts every segment of aviation. We are very appreciative and encouraged that the full committee chairman, Graves, has announced his intention for the first time ever to include in the title General Aviation for this year's FAA reauthorization. As a pilot himself, the chairman fully recognizes the service and the contribution GA brings to thousands of communities, and I'm certain he hears from private pilots every day. General aviation faces many challenges today, including the most significant, removing lead from aviation gasoline. The entire industry and the FAA are working on this issue every day, and we have made progress. One thing I can report to the committee is that general aviation has never been safer. With over 26 million flight hours transporting hundreds of millions of passengers, including more than 30 million takeoffs and landings, last year was the safest on record for general aviation, and this has been a positive trend. We also believe that in order to maintain the safest aviation system in the world, the committee should support investments in modernizing systems that are core to FAA's mission, whether it's ATC systems, the NOTAM system, the aircraft registration systems, the pilot medical system, all of which fall under the primary safety, certification, and regulatory functions of the agency. In order to secure the future of general aviation, the committee has an opportunity to address many of these issues that will set the course for years to come. We have provided the committee with a list of priorities and legislative concepts as a starting point. Many of these are outlined in my written testimony. However, being respectful of everyone's time, let me briefly address the following issues: workforce development, the FAA's designated pilot examiner program, hangar construction, and transient ramp space at public use airports. With respect to workforce development, I am very proud of AOPA's award-winning 4-year high school STEM aviation curriculum, which we provide to high schools for free. Our curriculum now is in more than 400 schools in 43 states. And since the program's inception, we have reached more than 50,000 students, and more than 70% of those who have graduated report they're actively pursuing a career in aviation. While we appreciate the committee's leadership in addressing and investing in aviation workforce challenges, we don't believe these issues will fall under the core mission of FAA. We join the entire aviation industry in supporting the establishment of the National Center for the Advancement of Aviation, which this committee and the House passed with Congress with nearly 400 votes. This center would allow the FAA to refocus its core on safety missions, help create effectiveness and efficiencies for government and many that work in the industry workforce programs. In the 2018 reauthorization, the committee stood up an industry-wide FAA working group to address shortcomings of designated pilot examiner program. As you know, the DPA examinations and check rides for pilots to determine a pilot's knowledge and capability of flying an aircraft. Just last summer, the working group developed 12 recommendations to improve the program. We'd like the committee to review and assist where possible the implementation to avoid the years of delay in fixing this program. We simply don't have enough DPEs in the system to keep up with the demand. Pilots, whether new or experienced, shouldn't have to wait weeks or months to get a check ride. AOPA conducted a national survey of 800 airports that found that 71% have a shortage of GA hangars. In many instances, airports have to land and construct, and lack of financial resources may have waiting lists years long for hangars. Finally, Mr. Chairman, I would like to bring the subcommittee's attention to an issue that has been and remains a top concern among every sector of the pilot community: the lack of transient ramp space at federally obligated public use airports. While we support the FBO industry and most provide excellent services, I have a letter here that has over 300 organizations on board, representing hundreds of thousands of pilots flying every category of aircraft from every region across the country, and I urge the committee to address this issue. This has been one of the most frustrating issues since pilots in the committee addressed the medical reform for GA pilots. I want to be clear, this is a national problem, not a one-off or a local issue. All federally obligated airports are subject to rules and regulations that impact safety and the users of the national system. All these airports should be required to treat all users the same when it comes to public access. Pilot organizations like AOPA, representing general aviation pilots, that believe one should not be required to pay a private business for services that the pilot never asked for or needed. This is exactly what's happening at hundreds of public use airports, especially those that have entered into lease agreements with large chain FBOs in a monopoly position. Not a day goes by that I don't hear from pilots about this. I must say I've been in business all my life. I've never known anyone that charges a customer for services the person never wanted or asked for. So I hear from it often. On behalf of the organizations and the pilots across the country, we strongly support and request the committee to include a provision in the reauthorization bill that addresses public use airports in these areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Baker. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the letter referenced by Mr. Baker in his testimony. And without objection, so ordered. Next, we're going to hear from Mr. Jack Pelton, CEO and Chairman of the Board for the Experimental Aircraft Association. You are recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Thank you, and good morning, Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Larson, and the rest of the Aviation Subcommittee. Thank you for inviting EA here at Experimental Aircraft Association today to provide our input on FAA reauthorization, securing the future of general aviation. EA is an organization that's been around for 70 years, who originally was founded for people who are building and restoring their own airplanes. Today, we essentially represent the entire spectrum of recreational aviation. We have over 250,000 members, over 900 local chapters, and we host over 14,000 aviation activities each year. If you look at the fleet-wide survey that is done by the FAA, the active fleet of amateur-built aircraft has grown by more than 30% in the last 20 years. And actually, on an annual basis, there's about 1,000 new amateur-built aircraft that enter the NAS. One of the initiatives that we are well known for is our Young Eagles program, which is in its 30th year. Our Young Eagles program takes young people for their first experience in flight through our members who provide their airplane, their time, and their fuel to provide these free introductory flights. We've flown over 2.3 million young people, and this experience has introduced them to general aviation, and then many of them have pursued careers as military or airline pilots, aerospace engineers, and a host of other aviation-related activities. So we've created a generation, essentially, of people who have a deeper appreciation for aviation, thanks to their first flight with EA. We also participate in summer Air Academy residence camps in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, and we have online portals for young people and teachers to learn and understand more about general aviation. A lot of people think of us as just the association that has an annual convention held in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, where over 10,000 aircraft arrive and 600,000 people attend from 90 nations. I had the opportunity to take the equivalent of the FAA administrator from Germany around, who looked at me and said, "You have more airplanes, general aviation airplanes, on the ground here than we have registered in the country of Germany." Ranking Member Cohen had outlined general aviation's importance to the aviation industry, and I will not continue to go back over that. It's clear that we're positioned as a world leader, but we have concerns. One of the foundations is general aviation, and we must retain this position. We must take action to ensure that our general aviation remains safe, healthy, and robust, since we are the gateway to aviation. We want to thank Transportation Infrastructure Chairman Graves for understanding this and addressing GA specifically in the next reauthorization bill. Key components to the industry's success is effective, efficient, and consistent regulatory oversight. FAA oversees, regulates almost all aspects of aviation, including air traffic control, aircraft design, production and maintenance, pilot and mechanic and crew certification, and airport operations. Aviation struggles when FAA is unable to provide timely oversight or effectively or inefficiently exercise its regulatory authority. Industry is stymied by the delays in processing of aircraft registrations or the issuance of pilot and mechanic certificates at all levels and timely completion of aircraft certification programs. Pilot training is a great example. As Mr. Baker mentioned, the shortage that we have with the designated pilot examiners is a crisis that needs to be addressed, and we hope that in FAA reauthorization, you can implement the recommendations of the designated pilot examiner reforms working group that came up with the recommendation to go to have national oversight as opposed to oversight at the local FSDOs. We also think as part of that, specialty DPEs should have the ability to go back to when we had the all makes and model authorization for experimental warbirds. Our number one issue is modernization of special airworthiness certificates. This is a regulatory rulemaking activity with a significant opportunity to grow general aviation with the expansion of existing aircraft categories called light sport aircraft. The current class of aircraft, whose size and weight limitations restricts useful training and commercial viability in the market. We are asking Congress to ensure that critical rulemaking continues to have support and needs to be directed to the FAA to publish by the end of 2024 this very important regulatory change. The Eagle Fuel Program was mentioned, of which we are strong supporters and participants in, and what we do need is to make sure that that Congress can help the safe introduction of the new fuel while still maintaining the supply of 100 low lead so that nobody is left grounded. We greatly appreciate the opportunity to appear before this committee, provide our views and the challenges and opportunities. Look forward to working with Congress and the FAA to ensure the United States remains the gold standard in aviation and that general aviation continues as a vibrant foundation to that standard. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Rick Kreider, testifying on behalf of the American Association of Airport Executives. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and good morning, Vice Chair Yackham, Ranking Member Cohen, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony and comment regarding general aviation issues in the upcoming FAA reauthorization process. I am appearing today on behalf of AAAE and member airports across the country, along with my own perspectives from operating Kelly Field in San Antonio, one example of a vibrant joint-use industrial GA airport. It's an honor to join this distinguished panel of industry leaders today and highlight the importance of general aviation and GA airports. GA airports often serve as key operational hubs for law enforcement, firefighting, aerospace manufacturing, air cargo, agriculture, and pilot training. They're important community portals for business and private aircraft operations, and in some cases play the role of economic engines, job centers, and R&D sites for new and emerging technologies. While GA airports vary significantly in size, complexity, and configuration, each provides unique functions and vital capabilities. Industrial GA airports like Kelly Field provide critical services to aircraft operators that require fleet maintenance, refurbishment, updates, and modifications. 10 months ago, the Port San Antonio opened a state-of-the-art innovation center, which I described in my written testimony, aimed at sparking interest in STEM within the student populations of San Antonio and exposing opportunities in aerospace and advanced technologies to the workforce of tomorrow. Kelly Field and other industrial GA airports are critical to maintaining our nation's dominance position in global aerospace industry. When an aircraft is either delivered to its customer or returned to service, thousands, if not millions, of parts, components, and labor hours are delivered to market. The FAA's NIPIAS reports $12.5 billion in annual AIP and bill-eligible projects at civil airports. Almost $4 billion of that total exists at non-primary airports alone. When projects that are not AIP or bill-eligible are added in, airport infrastructure needs exceed well more than $20 billion annually. This is roughly twice what airports received in AIP grants, bill funding, and PSC revenue every year. Congress can help address this gap by increasing AIP funding to at least $4 billion annually, authorizing additional funds for supplemental grants, and providing airports with more flexibility on how they invest those dollars. We urge Congress to adjust the outdated GA entitlement, which has remained stagnant at $150,000 for more than 20 years, and have other recommendations that are more fully described in my written testimony. I thank the subcommittee for its strong support of the FAA contract tower program, a successful public-private partnership that enhances aviation safety at GA and commercial service airports around the country. 25 Texas airports participate in the contract tower program. On behalf of my colleagues in the Lone Star State, I urge you to take additional steps to address staffing challenges, upgrade outdated towers, and ensure controllers have access to equipment that can increase their situational awareness. Like our counterparts at commercial airports, GA airports strive to be strong environmental stewards for their communities. Through AAA, GA airports are participating in the Eagle Initiative to transition to lead-free avgas for piston engine aircraft by the end of 2030. Airports are also eager to transition away from using firefighting foam that contains PFAS to fluorine-free foam, which is safer for the environment and firefighters alike. The FAA is expected to approve fluorine-free alternatives soon, and we ask Congress to help airports with that transition and acknowledge FAA's longstanding mandate to use PFAS by providing airports with a circle of liability protection. The future of advanced air mobility is quickly becoming the present for the aviation industry. GA airports will likely play a major role in this new AAM ecosystem and are excited to help make AAM a reality. However, to accommodate widespread use of eVTOLs in the future, we will need significantly greater electrical grid capacity and charging capabilities. We will also need to work together to find ways to pay for this infrastructure without reducing funds for traditional airport projects. Although travel has largely returned to pre-pandemic levels, stakeholders across the aviation system are still adjusting to the ripple effect caused by the pandemic. With the current FAA authorization set to expire on September 30th, I would like to commend this subcommittee for moving forward quickly to complete a multi-year build on time. Short-term extensions bring about both uncertainty and a lack of predictability for the aviation system, particularly for airports that rely on AIP funds to modernize our infrastructure. On behalf of AAA and all of my colleagues at GA and commercial service airports around the country, we look forward to working with this subcommittee as you prepare for the next FAA reauthorization bill. And I thank you and look forward to the questions that the subcommittee might have.
Thank you, Mr. Kreider. Mr. Kurt Castagna, President and CEO of the National Air Transportation Association. You are recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Chairs Graves and Graves, ranking members Larson and Cohen, and distinguished members of the Aviation Subcommittee. As President and CEO of the National Air Transportation Association and as an aviation business owner, I appreciate the opportunity to offer solution-based testimony today, drawn from member input. I'm pleased to join the other members of today's panel in advocating for a healthy general aviation ecosystem that supports collaborative partnerships between airports, aviation businesses, airport users, and local communities, consistent with FAA policy, airport access, and self-sustainability. As the voice of aviation business for more than 83 years, NATA represents a vital transportation industry that employs over 1 million individuals, creates $247 billion in economic output, and provides critical access to aeromedical emergency services, rescue, cargo, and on-demand passenger service to countless communities. Our 3,700 member locations include fixed-based operators, air charter providers, maintenance repair stations, and flight schools, as well as more than 300 general aviation airports. Collectively, NATA members serve the general public, recreational pilots, business aviation, airlines, and the military. Today's hearing comes at a critical juncture for both general aviation industry, which is experiencing high activity levels and rapid innovation in aircraft design, safety, and alternative fuel sources, and as well the FAA, which provides critical regulatory oversight of our industry. NATA appreciates the many competent, collaborative, and committed FAA leaders we work with on a daily basis. However, we also recognize the current antiquated systems hinder the agency's ability to perform timely certification, rulemaking, and oversight duties. The on-demand charter industry offers a perfect example. With 680 new certification requests currently in the FAA's backlog, it takes up to 2 years to secure a 135 certificate under the existing process. Adding a new aircraft to an existing certificate also takes up to a year, even when that aircraft has been subject to ongoing FAA conformity. Lastly, 135 operators cannot secure timely checks with FAA inspectors and struggle to get their own check pilots approved, which compounds our acute workforce shortage. Congress can legislate solutions for these problems by mandating FAA industry working groups, digitized processes, and online dashboards, expanded use of third-party evaluators and carrier checks, and in some cases, just simple implementation of existing FAA policy. We also encourage Congress to address the needs of general aviation airports to modernize infrastructure, prepare for advanced air mobility, and increase sustainability. As my colleague, Mr. Kreider, mentioned, the 150,000 AIP entitlement for GA airports has remained stagnant for over 20 years, and rising inflation and soaring construction costs make that current entitlement not very effective. We ask Congress to increase the GA entitlement and to adopt a tiered funding formula based on flight activity to account for the diversity of size and needs of GA airports. As the industry grapples with dangerous PFAS chemicals in airport rescue trucks and hangar foam fire systems, we seek federal guidance and assistance on a transition away from fluorinated foams and exemption from PFAS-related litigation for airports and as well aircraft hangar owners that have been subject to those regulations. NATA is committed to removing lead from avgas. We support funding to accelerate testing and approval for unleaded fuel that meets the requirements of the entire piston fleet, as well as the investments in infrastructure now to make the existing unleaded fuel more widely available. We must take creative steps now for the adoption of an alternative unleaded fuels, increasing their commercial availability and expanding infrastructure to accommodate them. For example, short-term tax credits for refiners, blenders, and distributors of approved unleaded fuel would incentivize production and accelerate deployment, much as in the case of SAFs. Advanced air mobility holds enormous promise to reduce aircraft emissions, enhance cargo and medical transport in rural areas, and facilitate urban mobility. NATA sees a natural nexus between existing Part 135 operators, general aviation airports, FBOs, and the AAM innovation. Both urban and rural general aviations offer ideal spaces to introduce eVTOL technology, and NATA members are preparing to support and maintain this next generation of aircraft. Lastly, we ask Congress to help our industry efforts to recruit a diverse and resilient workforce by expanding Section 625 grants, extending federal loan programs to aspiring pilots and aircraft mechanics, and broadening the on-ramp to non-traditional technical jobs with new grants, targeting other aviation workforce sectors. Thank you for your opportunity to testify on behalf of aviation businesses, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you to our witnesses for taking time to come here today and provide testimony. I now yield 5 minutes to myself for questions. I know many different people have different entry points into the aviation world, whether it's a career or even just a hobby. And I want to share a little bit of my own story before I begin. As an 8-year-old child, I was over at my Uncle Chuck's house and looked on the floor in the corner, and I noticed an F-16 sitting on the floor. It was a model F-16 that was a remote control airplane, and I began asking questions. And from a little 8-year-old child, it spawned a lifelong fascination with aviation. I went on after that to fly anything you can fly with a remote control, everything from airplanes to seaplanes to helicopters, drones, I mean, you name it, and I fly it with a remote control. And as I sit here today, I'm an FAA check ride and an FAA written exam away from having my own general aviation certificate. But one of the things I'm concerned about as I look at the next generation is the overall pipeline for the next generation of pilots and airplane mechanics. And I know there's a lot of focus on older students in aviation, but I would think, 8-year-old Rudy would say that sometimes that interest is sparked at a much younger age. And one of the things that my interest in model aviation taught me at a very early age is everything from physics to aerodynamics to control surfaces and flying and just the overall fascination of how an airplane actually works. But the hobby, it didn't break the bank. And it seems to me that even looking at the last FAA reauthorization bill, there were a lot of new regulations that were added to the hobby. And so we may need to revisit that and maybe even recalibrate that in the upcoming reauthorization. I'm not sure, maybe even perhaps you, Mr. Pelton, can speak to this. I know it's a little bit out of your lane, but even more broadly, I'm curious to know, what are some of the efforts of your respective associations to reach even further down into the education system and reach even younger students today?
Thank you for the question. Actually, it is in my lane. I'm glad that I turned out to be a better pilot than my RC flying when I was a kid like you, because I crashed an awful lot of them. We have a program at EA through our chapters, which we've collaborated with the AMA, the Modeling Association. It's called our Build and Fly program. And we have RC models that are, we believe that part of our mission is getting kids to work with their hands in the learning of basic education. And they build an RC kit at the local EA chapter, and then they collaborate with the AMA chapter in that area to actually go learn to fly that model, because we understand that 8-year-old to the 15-year-old has to have a different type of learning experience for aviation, because you can't go out and take a written test, you can't start your flight training or do any of that. So we're trying to fill that gap where Mark does such a great job then of taking the formal education piece in the post-secondary or in the high schools. And so we collaborate between the two of us on that. We do think that the modeling rules got wrapped up in the UAS craze of when hobby drones were so popular, and there was such a concern for the number of those being flown in improperly in incorrect areas, that we did leave behind the fixed-wing RC airplanes that fly at designated model fields that are already out there and identified and confined to basically 400 feet around that airfield. And we should go back and readdress that, because it has really put a damper on the RC flying for young kids.
Thank you. And now I'd like to yield 5 minutes to Mr. Cohen, the Aviation Subcommittee Ranking Member.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And that was an interesting story about your having that experience when you're 8 years old. I understand President Zelensky had one too. Yeah. Mr. Baker, in your testimony, you mentioned that the general aviation industry is on track to exceed the safety goals established by the Safety Committee of the General Aviation, which would result in another 10% reduction in fatal accidents over 10 years. In your opinion, which factors and policies contributed most to this decline, and how can we continue to decrease general aviation accidents?
The question I appreciate is about safety and how do we keep on track with either the technologies that we continue to move through and get approved to be used in general aviation aircraft. For instance, ADS-B gives you traffic inside your aircraft, certainly has helped in terms of awareness and weather that comes into your cockpit today on your iPad or whatever device you're using. So I think it's been a big part of reduction of accidents is the situational awareness that you have today in your cockpit, and it was provided by the FAA for free. So that has been a big, huge reduction in the accident rate. We still have more to go. We all agree with that. But to see that we've got flight hours up to 26 million flight hours from 20 million flight hours just 4 years ago, and have fatal accidents rates way down, we see as a huge improvement.
I had a constituent who was a friend and a great member of our community in Memphis who died in a plane accident maybe 6 months, a year ago. And he was in one of those planes that had a parachute that could come out and help it come down. He was pretty independent, ornery, and refused to do it. They told him, he said, I'm landing this plane. Well, he didn't make it. How are those parachutes coming? They can only be on very small planes. Is there any efforts to get them on a little bit larger planes and to use that as a capacity?
Primarily used by the Cirrus company, the Cirrus Aircraft Company out of Duluth, Minnesota. They use it on piston airplanes. They also have it on their small jet today. So they're the only company that actually builds it into the aircraft today as part of a production model. There are some aftermarket models available as well. But the Cirrus group has proven hundreds of lives have been saved by using the term just pull. And it's hard to engrave that in a lot of pilots because we think we can figure it out.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, just pull.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Castagna, Castagna, thank you, I guess. In your opinion, what investments in safety equipment, either at airports or on aircraft, can be made by Congress to improve the safety record of general aviation? Your microphone's not on, I don't think.
Thank you, Congressman. If I may, I'll use the state of Alaska as an example. With more than 200 airports throughout that state, 80% of the communities dependent on aviation for year-round access. Part 135 charter industry are critical to the life of Alaskans in that state, where we actually do medical service, deliver food, and in fact even take kids to school via aircraft. And the things that we can do in that area with the rugged terrain and the unpredictable weather is critical investments in weather cameras and weather stations that while they're in place today, they need to be upgraded and they need to be maintained. 20 years ago, we provided that system, And the agency announced there's 8 new automated weather observation systems bringing continuous real-time weather, which has a direct impact to safety of the operations of those flights. And while I use Alaska as just an example, those same automated weather systems and camera systems could be certainly used in the lower 48 states and more airports that would help enhance the safety of operations of general aviation activities.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Baker, you mentioned the ALPA's high school aviation STEM curriculum. Nearly half your students are students of color. What steps can the committee take to continue to advance diversity in our aviation workforce? And how can a proposed National Center for Advancement of Aviation advance this goal?
Something I'm very proud of, and thank you for that question about the STEM program that AOPA provides free to any high school that wants it. All we are required to do is teach the teacher how to teach the class. We made this product free from the 9th through the 12th grade because I wanted to make sure we could be in any school in the country. We do home schools in Alaska. We do inner-city schools all over the country. About half the students are people of color that are taking this, and over 25% are young women that are taking this class. And it's a very hard and difficult class. In STEM education, you have to pay attention. And to have over 50,000 young people have touched this class already, the opportunity with putting the NCAA together is to broaden the reach of this. So every state, well, the 43 today, but we have states like Oklahoma that have 70 high schools that are teaching this today. We have 16,000 students right now sitting in classrooms around the country learning about aviation education and career opportunities that have never been better.
Do you by chance know if they have that in Memphis?
Sorry?
Do they have that program in Memphis schools?
Yes, they do.
Excellent. FedEx can use those pilots. Thank you, sir, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cohen. I now yield 5 minutes to my colleague, Mr. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Baker, what can we do to, and I'm asking the question because I heard it twice in a row there, and I'm a student pilot, so I'm not to my check ride yet. DPEs, what do we do to get more people into that?
In the aviation?
Yes, sir.
So I think this high school program is a way in the Mr. Pelton and team that EAA in terms of giving rides and bringing people to the airport and having great events at the airport and exposing young people to the idea that they have careers there, whether they be military, airline, or flying for general aviation. The opportunities have never been better. And so that's why I'm excited about what our high school program does and working together with some of these EAA chapters around the country, getting kids out to the airport and seeing that they can be part of this great community. That's part of the exposure that I think we have more opportunity. We're doing really well. This year, we're going to see a record number of pilots' licenses being granted.
Okay. Did you want to add something to that, Mr. Pelton?
You brought up DPE also?
No, sir.
Okay. No, Mark covered it very well.
Okay. All right. Mr. Baker, I want to venture over to some cybersecurity. NOTAM. NOTAM, it seems like the FAA had more focus on changing the name of that acronym, writing a 176-page rule, spending thousands and thousands of dollars to do that. Notice to Airmen was changed to Notice to Air Missions. I asked if it was a safety change, which no answer was given. That's a 30-year-old software program. They could have spent time improving that, which they didn't. They spent time changing a name because their focus is more on being woke than they are on safety. On Tuesday, the TSA released emergency updates for aviation cybersecurity requirements for aircraft and aircraft operators and airports. Do you think the FAA is being proactive to invest, direct, and implement cybersecurity requirements for aircraft? Is the FAA doing enough to keep the pilots, crew, and passengers safe from potential cyber attack?
So from a perspective of a cyber attack, I was surprised, I think, as everybody else in aviation, that there's a single point of failure around the NOTAM system, which has been around for a long period of time. Very frustrating. But we know some of the systems that we use for aircraft registration or medical certificates are months and months and months behind. So the FAA needs to focus on all of these systems that they are employing today to make sure that they're up to date.
And I'd open that up to anybody else who'd like to.
I think the concern we all should have is anybody that's running a business today knows what the threats are and what we're spending on an ongoing basis to prevent cyber attacks. And I think we ought to probably have the FAA go benchmark what are these large companies that have been held hostage by ransomware and other cyber attacks like that to see what kind of plans they put in place, because it's not only the protection, but it's also the ability to recover and stand your systems back up.
On the February the 7th, Representative Rouser asked Acting Administrator Bolter and that same question, basically, and it was pretty insufficient response. So I think I'll just ask it again to everybody. Do you think the FAA has an actual plan to cyber secure the aircraft that we all depend on to get to our jobs and see our loved ones? Or is the FAA falling behind on their responsibilities to keep Americans safe?
I certainly don't have any insight as to what they're doing.
Okay.
That wouldn't be in my swim lane.
Congressman, I would say that the technology advancement in excuse me? I would say that the technology advancement in aircraft today that require Wi-Fi and other connectivity in the technology at our aviation businesses, there's a huge demand for creating more bandwidth, and with that bandwidth comes more risk for cyber security and attacks, where a lot of these software programs in the aircraft are dependent on that access at airports to upgrade their software systems. And so I'm not sure there's a plan that's in place today to accommodate that, but there's certainly a need for it.
I would echo that too, that there's a focus on cybersecurity from the airport operators because there's so much connection between airline information, user information, FAA information, that all comes together at that platform. So very much a focus of the airport industry and close collaboration with the FAA and Circle as well.
Thank you. From what I've been hearing from people I've been talking to, it seems like there's a big disconnect between the mid-level management and the executive branch of the FAA. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. Now I recognize Mr. Larson, ranking member of the full committee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First off, I want to make a note that I'm very happy the FAA has changed the name of NOTAMs to Notice to Air Missions. It's inclusive, and we need to be sending a message to everybody to attract as many people into aviation as possible. And the problem with NOTAMs isn't the name change. The problem with NOTAMs is a lack of technology investment, which we have an opportunity to work together on to resolve, and that we can stay focused on working together to resolve this problem as part of the FAA reauthorization. I'm looking forward to doing that in a bipartisan manner. Mr. Castagna, with the first unleaded fuel finally certified last year, the FAA's new goal for completely transitioning the GA fleet is 2030. Is that timeline still realistic?
The process for the transition to unleaded fuel, as we know, is a complex process. We believe that there's a pathway forward to do that, and potentially the means to do that in advance of 2030. I would say that there's a commercially viable unleaded fuel product that's out in the market today. While we know that it only serves 70% of the fleet, we know that those airports that are critically sensitive to environmental impacts, and if they do an inventory of their own piston fleet, in some cases, airports, their based piston aircraft could exceed that 70%. So our position is really to encourage airports to work together with FBOs and the user community to find ways to bring the commercially available product to the marketplace today, especially in those environmentally sensitive communities that are impacted, in advance of 2030. And ask Congress to put the resources necessary into whether it's tax credits or incentives for the refinement and blending of that fuel to get it out into the marketplace sooner.
Yeah, thanks. Mr. Baker, can you answer that same question?
So yes, I believe that we have one fuel that has an STC today that was approved in September of last year. I believe there's an attempt to start rolling that out airport by airport in a controlled environment, hopefully in the next several months. I believe that that's our first opportunity. There are another STC applicant right behind that, and the PAFI process is still in process. But I have more confidence today than I did a year ago when we started the Eagle, that we have got the whole industry working together to solve this problem as quickly as possible, but as safely as possible, because we cannot just transfer this to 94 octane and hope that the other airplanes find fuel somewhere else. We have to keep low lead available while we have this process going on.
Yeah, and I appreciate it. The transition has to still result in aviation safety. That has to be the priority of the committee as we move forward. But if there are ways, because frustrated communities, angry communities, because of leaded fuel, finding a way to move that timeline safely is going to be important. And I hope we put some focus on that and not resist that as we move forward on FAA reauthorization. I was going to ask, Mr. Kreider, on the funding side of things through the BIL, Are you satisfied, or maybe that's the wrong question since you represent a lot of airports. If you had to pick your friends, which ones you had? No. The distribution of the dollars for the BIL, from the BIL for airports, from a either a percentage or from a numbers and absolute numbers perspective, is GA getting its fair share? GA airports, smaller airports, non-primary airports getting its fair share? How would you assess that?
Well, I can speak to my own example at Kelly Field. Bill was a huge shot in the arm. We're using that, putting that money to work for design of a consolidated facility, which supports fixed-based operations, federal inspection station, advanced air mobility, all those good things. But I think at the end of the day, really looking at the formula, how GA airports are funded, the entitlement portion is really critical, and that's part of the testimony many of us have touched on. I represent a large industrial commercial, a lot of commercial activity. So we have everything from the very largest design group 6 aircraft, like a 747-8s, all the way down to a Cessna 172. So that $150,000 is really a drop in the bucket, frankly, on projects of that, that respond to that scale. So I think it's a mixed bag, but certainly Bill was a great shot in the arm, and hopefully that this reauthorization can have more good to come.
Yeah, thanks. Mr. Pelton, on the safety issue, the safety within GA and Arlington Municipal, where I grew up, a small town, is a pretty active experimental aviation crowd there, doing good things. We've also had, in the past, had some serious accidents as well. Can you chat a little bit, maybe specific to your part of the industry and on safety and what you do to try to decrease incidents and accidents?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the question. The experimental amateur built, started out back in the 50s with a pretty poor safety record. One was because they weren't necessarily well-engineered and designed products. There were people on their own in their garage coming up with designs to go fly. As this industry has evolved, it really is now down to major aircraft kit manufacturers who have extremely well designed, tested, and proven products that are holding up well with the safety record. They're also including now, because of the ability to not have to put certified products in the airplane, it has the latest up-to-date safety enhancements in the cockpits that we're seeing, so that's improving also. And last year, we made a significant change to the flight testing program for anybody that does build a new airplane that really helps add a second pilot in the airplane that has experience in that make and model to ensure it's tested appropriately and properly. So we're seeing very good progress. We track it monthly.
That's great. Mr. Chair, I want to apologize for 2 days in a row going a full 54 seconds over my time, and I will do better in the future with that. I will not yield back since I have no time to yield back.
The chair will reserve his comments. I now yield 5 minutes to my friend, Mr. Stauber.
Mr. Chair, thank you very much, and thanks to the witnesses. We talked about the NOTAM bill that passed out of the House with 424 votes, bipartisan. I would encourage us all to talk to our senators to get it across the finish line, because we can get that task force up and running very, very quick, which will increase safety in the skies. I'm very excited that we will have a general aviation title in this reauthorization bill. General aviation is the backbone of our aviation system. As someone who started working on their private pilot license later in life, I want to encourage more and more individuals to get involved with aviation at a younger age, and wanted to make it more accessible. That is why I would like to focus my time on the National Center for the Advancement of Aviation, or as it's commonly referred to as the NCAA bill. As you know, the NCAA bill was introduced in the last Congress by Mr. Carson and my former colleague, the late Don Young from Alaska. Well, nobody can fill Congressman Young's shoes. I'm announcing today that I will be joining Mr. Carson to reintroduce the bipartisan, bicameral NCAA bill. I firmly believe this center will help coordinate industry and government aviation workforce efforts, inspire and train the next generation of aviators, and boost innovation in American flight. Mr. Baker, thank you for being here. It is always good to have a fellow Minnesotan on the panel. I know AOPA has been a long champion of the NCAA. It also has been intimately involved in workforce programs such as your high school STEM program, which is quite impressive. Could you please speak to your AOPA STEM program a bit more and share the NCAA will help, and share how the NCAA will help expand the STEM program and grow it?
Thank you for the question, fellow Minnesotan. The STEM program was started about 6 years ago and built the 9th grade curriculum, which is about introduction to all things aviation. By the 10th grade program, they start to learn about airfoils, building wind tunnels out of a covered box with a fan.
Yeah.
So these are very low-cost ways to get young people to understand what lift and drag and all those things that go into the components, and hopefully inspiring people to be an engineer, as well as a controller, as well as a pilot, or whatever mechanic that comes out of the opportunities that we show them the lifetime earnings by the time they're in the 11th grade about the money you can make today in an aviation career everywhere. And what I'm really proud to say is we now know, because we've been doing this for 5 years, the graduating class, 70% of these young people are going into some form of aviation career pattern. A third of them were actually looking at the military as one of the possibilities as well. We work with the Air Force and their recruiting staff to make sure that we are tying these young people. There's over 80 colleges today around the country that will give you college credits for taking these classes in high school.
Yep.
So it really saves this young person a lot of money for their freshman year, their junior year in college credits. So we're really proud of the program today with 400 high schools. I think the opportunity is to get to 2,500 high schools, about 10% of all the high schools in this country. Working with the NCAA, which is coordinating all the other things that go on in this aviation industry, because we all care about the same outcome, workforce.
You know, the return on the investment, 70% go into the aviation sector. That's tremendous. That's called great success. In closing, I will say that the National Center for the Advancement of Aviation overwhelmingly passed the House last year. It has the support of the entire aviation industry, from general aviation, airlines, airports, unions, manufacturers, and many others. Again, I appreciate working on this issue to honor the late Congressman Don Young. I know myself and Mr. Carson will work with our colleagues to see this included in the FAA reauthorization. And Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Stauber. The chair now recognizes Mrs. Brownlee for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Kreider, first, thank you for mentioning the Contract Act in your testimony. I appreciate it very much. Very glad that we got it in the omnibus package at the end of last year. You mentioned in your testimony that controller staffing still continues to be a challenge. So can you talk a little bit about what else you think Congress can do to help ensure that we have enough controllers at contract tower airports?
Certainly. Well, first of all, Representative Brownlee, thank you for your leadership on that appropriations language. That was important, and the Contract Act was very impactful. But I think to answer your question, looking at the wage scales, we've seen a period of inflation, and so the contract tower program has fell prey to that. So Department of Labor focus on the wage scales that contract tower contractors are able to pay, I think is important. And I think a better coordination between the FAA towered programs and the contract tower programs. We understand that there's a migration of folks, especially young people, that start at the contract tower and then move up to the FAA. But a better coordination about how that workforce happens so that we don't unintentionally impact contract hours at smaller airports, GE airports, smaller commercial service airports. I think those are two important improvements that could be addressed.
So what would that look like, in terms of FAA and contract and that transition?
The transition? Well, one of the things we hear from the contractors is a little more flexibility in how they do the training. So speed to market, if you will. The ability to do some on-the-job training and training more regionally, as opposed to being constricted by the flow of students that can go through Oklahoma City or other traditional. So part of it's just more aggressive and more innovative approaches to training. I think will help that workforce pipeline.
Thank you for that. And from your perspective, what do airports need from Congress to be able to expand the availability of sustainable aviation fuels?
Well, I think airports, stand ready to be part of that conversation. We're excited to be part of Eagle. It's a great collaboration of associations, from OEMs, from the fuel manufacturers. So being a part of that, I think, is important. It was mentioned before that we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Airports stand ready to make sure the infrastructure is in place for this transition. But we don't want to be premature about making the change. In other words, be a part of the conversation, help with the solutions, but also be mindful that we don't want to impede the important activities that happen at GE airports, many of those with avgas burning aircraft.
Great. Mr. Baker, do you have anything to add with regards to that?
Yeah, I think if I understand the question correctly, how does Congress help us grow aviation with these general aviation airports? And as I mentioned a bit ago, a real hot button for our users of these airports today is a requirement that all federally obligated airports provide a transient ramp space for aircraft so that they can park their airplanes there regardless of make or model, whether they need or not need an FBO service, a place to park at these airports. And as well as I mentioned about hangars, we're woefully short on hangars on these federally supported airports. They need to have those spaces there. And, I think there's opportunity to get badging requirements so that we can work together with the FBO so that instead of having a different badge for each airport, we can work with the TSA so we can expedite in and out of the airports with the security needs that they may have at those airports. Those are some of the things that Congress could really help us with.
Thank you. Mr. Castagna, do you have anything else to add on sustainable aviation fuel?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for passing the blender's tax credit. I think that supply cannot meet demand today with SAF, so we must continue to incentivize the commercializing of that product. We also must continue funding FAA's Ascent program and the Department of Energy's Beto office to continue their excellent work on SAF feedstocks and technology. And SAF represents the best way for today's aircraft to really reduce the environmental carbon footprint. And so the investments in these areas we think are critical.
What about incentives for production of SAF?
So those same tax incentives and credits would be for production and refinement and blending and ultimately delivery to the airports.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Brownlee. Chair now recognizes Mr. Perry for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair. Mr. Baker, your testimony raises AOPA's concerns about Santa Clara County's decision to ban 100 low-lead aviation fuel. And I think I'm going to quote you here by saying, quote, required by thousands of general aviation aircraft to fly safely, and that the decision to ban it is, again, quote, simply irresponsible. Now, look, if you want to have a private airport and ban airplanes, that's your business. God bless you. But if we're going to be federally funding your airport, then we ought to have something to say about it. And I find it particularly offensive, not only unsafe but irresponsible, but offensive, that for some insane Green New Deal ideology, you're going to ban anything. If you're going to have a partially federally funded airport, you're going to provide the fuel necessary. And I don't know if anybody's familiar with catastrophic engine failure in flight, but I can guarantee you it is an unpleasant experience. Mr. Baker, can you explain the impact on those maybe flying law enforcement missions, disaster relief, search and rescue, understanding that we all like to fly something that uses Jet A? That's awesome, but we all can't afford Jet A. Can you explain the impact?
Yeah, it's a huge impact. Thank you for the question. We believe, working with the FAA and trying to enforce the idea that at a federally obligated airport, you're required to carry the fuel that it allows for the safe transportation in all aircraft, not just some of the aircraft. And we've already had one misfueling accident in Santa Clara today. We've had other misfuelings that have gone, and they had to refuel or defuel the airplane. This ecosystem that goes together with these 5,000 public use airports is so important that they all provide the same level of safety and fuel for these aircraft. We all believe we can get to this transition by 2030, but we need to make sure that we don't have gaps in that system in the meantime. So that's one of the things we're pushing really hard to make sure that we have a supply of low-lead fuel until there's an alternative fuel in place that can support all aircraft, not just some.
And the alternative needs to be affordable, right? Not just some alternative that meets the specific requirement, but nobody can afford to use, again, to go after the insane Green New Deal ideology. Could you provide the subcommittees with some details surrounding the accident in question regarding Santa Clara's ban of 100 low-lead and the misfueling that took place?
As I understand it, a high horsepower, approximately a 300 horsepower engine, got to the airport, needed fuel to get onto the next port, put on some fuel, and I don't know exactly what happened to the detonation of that engine, but the engine came apart shortly after takeoff.
And what resulted at that point?
Fortunately, there was no fatalities, but certainly anytime you have an aircraft coming out of the space in an urban area, there's high risk.
Yeah, high risk. And I will tell you, the pucker factor, if you're sitting in the seat, or anywhere in the aircraft. And that's what we call it when we're in the seat. The pucker factor goes like you can't pull a fishing line out of your rear end with a tractor, all right? And that's not a position to put pilots in for, again, insane Green New Deal woke ideology. In the past few committee hearings, I've raised the issue, and unfortunately these concerns that I've had have become reality. The upcoming FAA reauthorization bill is something that we're looking forward to. And in your opinion, I know mine, but I want to hear yours because you're representing folks that don't get to sit in these seats. What should Congress do to ensure these things don't happen?
I think there's two things that Congress can do. One is to make sure that we don't lose availability of 100 low lead until there is a suitable, affordable replacement. The second thing we could do is to try and work with some of these STC holders to try and get it to go faster, to try and get the fuel in these markets faster, so we get some learnings done and some demonstrations done. I think there should be some money allocated to these STC holders to try and get that fuel in the market faster. But in the meantime, we cannot allow slippage in any part of this ecosystem that doesn't keep 100 low lead available.
So should there be a penalty of sorts for airports federally funded that decide to ban it?
That's correct.
There should, you would agree there should be?
I agree.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield the balance.
Thank you, Mr. Perry. The chair now recognizes Mr. Stanton for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing today. Thank you to each of our witnesses for being here today. General aviation is a key part of Arizona's aviation economy, supporting nearly 19,000 jobs and contributing $3.3 billion in economic activity just in 2019. And in Arizona, we have 3 of the top 10 busiest general aviation airports in the country. So ensuring continued support for and growth of general aviation must be a top priority for FAA reauthorization. Today, I want to focus on the Contract Tower program, which is one of the FAA's most successful government industry partnership and serves the general aviation community. In Arizona, we have 7 contract towers, including Phoenix Mesa Gateway, the busiest contract tower in the country in terms of traffic. This important air safety program maintains and develops general aviation activity and supports DoD flight training operations and military readiness, as well as the pilot flight schools all across the country. And it's also important to note that contract towers account for approximately 1/3 of all tower operations in the nation, and about 70% of contract controllers are veterans. Mr. Kreider, what benefits does the contract tower program provide to the national airspace system, especially for the general aviation community?
Well, I think it's a tremendous success story. It's been proven many times that the safety record is on par with the FAA towers. It really serves as an entry point for airports that are reached that point of operations where they need a tower. So it's a great entry point for ATC activities. We talked before about some of the workforce issues, but I think a renewed focus on reconstruction, rebuilding, refurbishing the towers that are in place, the workforce itself, as we talked about, but also the real-time equipment that the controllers need to integrate into a national airspace system, make sure they have the situational awareness and the equipment that facilitates that safe transition.
And you mentioned workforce. I know my colleague, Congressman Brownlee, had a question about workforce earlier. Staffing shortages continue to be a major challenge throughout the industry, including at Phoenix Mesa Gateway Airport. We recently opened a brand new $30 million air traffic control tower at Phoenix Mesa Gateway, but staffing shortages have reduced operations at the tower by 4 hours each day because contract employees have unfortunately left, often with only a few weeks' notice, to go work for the FAA instead. These positions cannot easily be filled, as it often takes 6 months to train a new controller, and that leaves airports like Phoenix Mesa Gateway with difficult operational decisions in order to adjust. I want to ask a question about it because you already talked about workforce issues, but Mr. Kreider, on a different note, your written testimony highlights the important role that general aviation sector will play in the deployment of advanced air mobility. Can you elaborate on general aviation airports' potential infrastructure needs to help accommodate this new technology?
Absolutely. I think that what we're seeing, whether it's the EV tolls or some of the other emerging technologies, that R&D is done at GE airports. Typically, it's for reasons of operations or available land or for whatever reason. So I think GA airports will continue to play a really important role in where those vehicles are built, where they're tested and proven. And ultimately, I think they provide a new dimension for underserved markets, for regional air mobility, for last mile, if you will, or connectivity to the hub and spoke system. So I think this entire discussion of advanced air mobility is truly ripe for the GA airport community and communities that are served by GA airports.
My last question is for Mr. Castagna. What key elements should the FAA consider as it develops the necessary certification and operating standards for AAM?
Thank you, Congressman. Great question. I think that there's an extreme nexus between the current 135 operators that exist today and those regulatory processes and the AAM community, where it's a natural segue, where we believe that that industry is going to rely on that same type of regulatory platform. Our organization's prepared to, and we've already established a committee to meet with the AAM and in the vertiport community to see how we can integrate those activities into our regulatory process to advocate for those. And as well, and to tap onto what Mr. Kreider said, the infrastructure required at airports, it requires the streamlining of building codes and other types of coordination where we'll be able to provide the necessary power grid to support those activities.
I appreciate your answers. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Stanton. The chair now recognizes Mr. Burchett for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Y'all all probably got up this morning and thought, wow, I'm going to go to Congress. It's going to be really exciting. And they brought you in here, and they don't offer you any snacks. So I'll try to make this as painful as possible for each and every one of you. Mr. Kreider, the FAA required airports to use a toxic firefighting foam. And now, of course, it's warning the airports that it may be held liable for doing so. Is that correct?
That's correct. I think that that's a big focus of airports, to make sure that there's protections in place.
Well, what do these airports need to do to transition to a new firefighting material?
Well, I think first of all, we need to patiently await for the new materials.
Wait, say that again. I'm sorry.
Well, I think first of all, we're all patiently awaiting for the new materials to be approved. So having a viable alternative to PFAS materials is first in line. But generally, airports preparing to make the transition as far as vehicles and equipment, those are all big factors. So again, it's another topic. You don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's a regulated material. It's used for to enhance safety. So none of us want to jeopardize safety or an important tool to save lives until there's a valid alternative in place.
But you're confident something's in the pipeline, so to speak?
Sir?
You're confident that this new material is in the pipeline, so to
Yes.
speak, to be?
Yes.
Any idea when they'll wave the magic wand and say it's okay?
No magic wand, sir. We
Probably
can
about the
get you an
time that-
IOU on that, though. So certainly, I don't have that in front of me. But
Right, probably about the time the new one, they need another one. So, and Mr. Castagna, how do you say that name? Help me out there, brother.
Castagna, like
Castagna, I got it.
lasagna, there you go.
I got you. We'll birch it. Nobody gets it right either, so don't worry about it. Does the FAA, do you think they issue timely rulemaking? Of course, this is the leading question, so go ahead.
So the rulemaking process is certainly troubling for our members and needs refinement.
What kind of timeline do you usually put on something like that when you're sitting around at the coffee table at work?
Well, when we're looking at rulemaking today, you're looking at least a year-long process or
Wow.
more.
Well, if it's any consolation, it takes me over 6 months to get a response from the IRS, so that's not for me personally, it's for my constituents. Do you feel like this affects America's influence on international aviation standards?
The rulemaking, I absolutely do, from the standpoint of, our collective industry here has been the world's leading power in aviation, and the fact that we're slowing down the process, we're competing now with other foreign governments that are moving technology and moving activities at a much faster pace than we are.
Mr. Pelton or Mr. Baker, Do you have anything to add to any of this?
As far as rulemaking is concerned, it's absurdly long. I mean, I don't think, when you talk about 12 months, it's usually 24 months. We've been working this mosaic issue, which is very important to the growth of general aviation, and I think everybody's in agreement as to what needs to be done, and it'll be 2024 before we see it. Because of that, we're not able to certify electric-powered airplanes, which right now, this is some of the environmental issues that we're dealing with, along with new technologies that are being held behind. What's probably the most offensive as a U.S. citizen is Brazil has already put this in place, and they did it in less than a year.
Brazil has.
They put what the equivalent of mosaic improvements to LSA, the LSA category of airplanes.
You mentioned the electric airplanes. I know that I saw something on hydrogen airplane, hydrogen-powered, green hydrogen or whatever that is. I mean, you know, it's just a byproduct of water, but go ahead. I'm wondering, where is that in your all's figuring?
I mean, hydrogen has been around in development, and everybody jumped all the way to the electric power, which I think we've all found that the battery density power is not where it needs to be.
Yeah, I suspect the big boys at the table, corporate table, probably figured that out pretty quick, that, you know, if somebody could fill up in Knoxville down there at Fort Loudon Lake and cut them out of their deal. So, but I'm not a conspiracy theorist, and I'm not bitter either. But
I think, though, when you get back to the rulemaking piece, this is another example of there are many technologies out there that we need to explore and let those who are ready to be able to be implemented, allow them to move forward without jumping to the far end of the technology curve.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Mr. Baker, I have no time left, so if you can say something quickly so you can earn your keep today. You're good? All right. That's great. Mr. Chairman, yield back the remainder of my time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Burchett. Chair now recognizes Mr. Auchincloss for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and Mr. Baker, I'll let you get a turn here. You mentioned in your testimony that modernizing the air traffic control system is among the primary safety and regulatory functions of the FAA. How can Congress use this FAA Reauth bill to help modernize outdated air traffic control systems and improve the workforce pipeline?
So the workforce pipeline, I think the support of the NCAA bill, which has been mentioned, is the number one way that we can move that forward. As was mentioned before, 400 members of Congress approved it the last time around. It's important to get that done and pull the whole aviation community together to work on workforce, because there's a lot of young people that want to be in aviation. As far as other things that the Congress can do from a safety perspective and growing aviation, we think it's really important that we take these technologies, as Jack just mentioned. Some of these things, these technologies need to get approved faster and faster, and they're way too slow today in the rulemaking process.
Thank you. Mr. Kreider, I'm interested in ways that airports can more effectively manage curbside traffic to improve the passenger experience and improve throughput from curb all the way to the gate. One way smart cities are tackling this issue is through remote enforcement of curb management policies, drop-off, parking, et cetera. This allows cities to better manage the curb in a more cost-effective way. How could large and medium-sized airports benefit from remote curbside enforcement?
Well, I think there's a myriad of technologies that are being deployed at airports, whether it's for TNCs or, which goes, speaks directly to curbside management.
TNCs?
Transportation network carriers.
Oh, TNCs, got it.
TNCs, I'm sorry. The Ubers and the Lyfts of the world, to, wait time analysis, and they give, the passenger better information and a better experience. So I think, the short answer is more technology and more integration of technology into the terminal.
Are there, at the FAA, or at the federal level, are there proscriptions or laws that are impairing the ability of airports to do remote enforcement of curbside management? So obviously, you're allowed to get traffic enforcement.
Not that I'm aware of, but we can certainly get an answer back to you. Let me confirm.
I'd appreciate that. If you could follow up with my office on impediments you see to the ability to use technology to do remote enforcement, I'd appreciate that.
So specifically to remote enforcement?
I think we'd love your input on the entire curb management situation, but particularly on whether airports are interested in trying to do remote enforcement and are held back by existing federal law or regulation from FAA.
Okay.
And then, again for you, Mr. Kreider, you mentioned in your testimony that capital needs for non-primary and GA airports are more than $19 billion over the next 5 years, and I agree that supplementary discretionary grants and increased AIP funding could help support commercial and GA airports' ongoing infrastructure needs. coupled with additional flexibility in how airports can spend AIP funds. Could you walk us through why airports need that additional flexibility, especially larger airports like Logan at Boston?
Well, I think there's some trends that, regulatory process, environmental clearances, Part 163 requirements that slow down development. And candidly add cost to the development. So I think those are some areas that a better collaboration between the airports community, the FAA, and Congress to find the right mix. Certainly, we don't want to go backwards in the advancements of the reasons for those laws, but I think a streamlining of the regulatory process and approval process is really what we're asking for.
Terrific. I'm going to yield back, actually, the rest of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Auchincloss. The chair now recognizes Mr. Molinaro for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. I spent the last 12 years overseeing one of the largest general aviation airports in New York State, Poughkeepsie, New York, recognizing the valuable role general aviation plays in the aviation community. I can tell you in my district alone, it's responsible for hundreds of jobs and $60 million worth of economic activity. It is very much the backbone of America's aviation world, and in many ways the pipeline to jobs. And so I'd like to continue down the workforce development path for a moment. Mr. Pelton, we recognize that there is increased obvious demand for pilots and moving them through that pipeline. U.S. flight schools are oversubscribed, both large and small. We know we're not able to meet the demand. And in many cases, of course, this is slowing down the ability to move pilots from general aviation into other occupations in the commercial sector. Could you just talk briefly about what happens to America's aviation system, if you will, if these flight schools don't exist, and quite frankly, also what we might do to expand capacity?
Well, thank you for the question. I think when you forecast forward what we're seeing as far as the needs and demands from pilots, whether it be the military or commercial aviation over the next 10 years, the facts pretty much stand for themselves as to if we're not able to keep that pipeline going, then our commercial travel will be slowed down because of the shortage of pilots to be able to operate in the commercial sector. So that's really where we'll see it long term, and that's an effort that's compounded by the retirement of airline pilots in the baby boomer era, and then the lack of new pilots coming forward. So it's critically important that we have a viable training sector, that we support it. Again, some of our earlier discussion around the ability to have designated pilot examiners, which are a shortage right now, is one of the leading factors to it. And we also believe that Mosaic, which is the regulatory rulemaking change that we're hoping will be able to bring new aircraft into the market that are more affordable and more efficient for the flight training market, also hoping to be able to reduce the cost associated with training with those new developments.
I appreciate that. We developed in conjunction with our community college, and I certainly would like to see more of this across the country, an experiential hangar for pilot training and airframe mechanics. Mr. Baker, could you just following up on your testimony regarding AOPA, the aviation STEM curriculum, speak specifically to the value of the Section 625 workforce development grants, how they help to prepare the next generation of aviation workforce?
So yes, our STEM program, which was funded exclusively by donors to the AOPA Foundation, was built over 4 or 5 years to create STEM education from the 9th through the 12th grade. And again, it's free to all the schools that want to do it. Today, we're in 400 schools. I think the opportunity to be in 2,500 high schools around this country, with about 1 out of every 10, is the opportunity. If we get the NCAA moving along the right way, I think we can get a lot of energy around this, because these opportunities can be used in high school to get college credits, whatever career it is, whether it's mechanic, technician, controller, pilot, engineer. All these career opportunities have never been better, and these young people are excited about it. And today, we've got over 40% of these young people are young people of color. We've got over 25% young women taking these tough classes in high school.
Yeah, it's truly tremendous, and the truth of the matter is, I think America does itself a disservice by not putting value on this education in K-12, and certainly then connecting to higher education and those flight schools to build out not only the workforce, but to create that connection to jobs that, quite frankly, pay exceptionally well. With the last name Molinaro, I only feel badly, Mr. Castagna, and I have nothing to ask you, but if you wanted to add, I feel like Mr. Baker was given an extra 8 seconds a few moments ago. Feel free to jump in.
If I may.
And then I yield, Mr. Chairman.
As an adjunct professor for over 30 years and having taught at the collegiate level for aviation and airport management, I would encourage us as we look for opportunities to increase the workforce development that we go beyond the traditional air traffic controller, pilot, flight attendant, mechanic, and look for the thousands of technical jobs that are available to our workforce in the airport and aviation community, and that we expand those grant opportunities beyond the traditional roles, and we look for more widespread use of technical jobs that might not require four-year educations.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Molinaro. The chair now recognizes Ms. Titus for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I represent Las Vegas, so you know how important general aviation is to my district. Without it, we wouldn't have corporate planes bringing people to our conventions or individuals coming out for big events. Now we're going to have the Grand Prix right down the strip in the middle of my district, and the Super Bowl also in my district. So I'm going to see a lot of y'all's planes coming in and out, I feel like. So this is important, and I appreciate all the testimony. Last session of Congress, I worked with Mr. Larson and Mr. Garrett Graves, to include the Advanced Aviation Infrastructure Modernization Act, and that gave money to local governments, tribal governments, to modernize airports. And I wonder, as this program rolls out, if you could talk about the potential infrastructure needs that general aviation has, as opposed to regular commercial airports when it comes to AAM technology.
Well, I can start. I think in our example at Kelly Field, we're building a consolidated facility that has advanced air mobility attributes to it. So preparing the electrical grid and the capacity for charging electrical vehicles. I'd like to give a shout out too, though, to the FAA. I think they've been very thoughtful. We talked about hydrogen earlier. Electric vehicles are the current, but we don't know what's going to be in the future. So I think a thoughtful consideration about how a hydrogen vehicle or a solar vehicle or a hybrid vehicle might utilize that infrastructure, I think, is also good, well-informed. So those are the ideas. And I think as airports like Kelly do more with advanced air mobility and connect up with other ecosystems like the military that's doing great things in advanced air mobility, and airports that are doing the research and development, the production, building out the ecosystem and recognizing that AAM is an important part of the future, and funding it appropriately is the right thing to do.
Thank you. Anybody else?
I would just add that in the design and the build of these facilities, the necessity for standards in the technology for, let's say, charging systems and connectivity to the grid between the various different user groups that we're dealing with. Much like we do with aircraft, traditional aircraft, there's a standardization process there that we follow. And so from a development standpoint of aviation facilities for AAM at airports, one of the things we're really looking to understand is what are the infrastructure requirements, what are the power needs, what are the, down to the connectivity to the actual charging unit to the aircraft, so that we can bring those technologies to market faster.
It's always better to do it in advance than to have to go back and rehab it down the road, so I appreciate that. Also, I'd like to build on something that Ms. Brownlee started asking about. And in the Inflation Reduction Act, we had a credit for sustainable aviation fuel, and I wonder if there are any barriers that y'all particularly face in general aviation transitioning from leaded gas, and also if there should be allocations for GAUs.
So I'll start with the SAF piece of that.
Okay.
We greatly appreciate the efforts of Congress to provide the tax credits, I believe, for 5 years. We'd really like to see those get pushed out in the incentives for 10 years. The supply chain obstacles that we have in getting that product to market sooner is one of our challenges. In lieu of that, we are working with book and claim programs so that our users can buy the fuel where they can and book and claim it and use it in markets where the fuel is currently not available. Oh. So the credits and the incentives to bring that product to the entire country, where right now it's really on either coastline, is bringing it to the center of the country will make it more widely distributed. It will also make it, the price point of it, more competitive.
I think there's an opportunity for Congress to look at, as these new fuel users come online, they're going to be very small batches of fuel being built. It's not going to be very competitive and could cost probably a little bit more than the current supply. We want to get the transition going as fast as possible and as safely as possible. So having some money set aside for these new fuels to come on board, get them introduced, whether they need new tanks, things like that, I think would be an important part of the discussion.
Thank you. Well, thank you, then I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Titus. Mr. Mann?
Thank you all for being here this morning. I represent the big first district of Kansas, which is 60 primarily rural counties, a little bit in the eastern, a lot in the central, and the entire western part of our state. Transportation infrastructure is vitally important. There's a strong relationship between the Kansas economy and aviation, has been for decades. Our state's system of commercial service and general aviation airports provide the gateway to the nation's air transportation system and the world's economy for our businesses. Aviation ranks second in economic impact in our state of Kansas, only after agriculture. The Big First, my district, is home to 39 general aviation airports, with Kansas having a total of 73. Our airports support thousands of jobs and billions of dollars in economic activity, which is why it's imperative that aviation safety remain a top priority. One of the FAA's most successful government industry partnerships, in my view, is the FAA Contract Tower Program, which enhances safety in our country, improves air traffic control services, and has increased savings to taxpayers. There are currently 262 airports in 46 states that participate in the Contract Tower Program, which you all know. 8 of those are located in Kansas. This critical air traffic safety program is important to maintain and develop general aviation activity and supports DoD flight training operations and military readiness, as well as pilot flight schools all across the country. It's also important to note that contract towers account for approximately 1/3 of all tower operations in the nation, and about 70% of contract controllers are veterans. Couple questions for Mr. Kreider. What benefits does the contract tower program provide the national airspace system, especially or specifically for the general aviation community?
Well, I think it's a huge part of enhancing safety. I mean, as I mentioned before, many airports that grow in operations to the point that they need air traffic separation, it's a great entry point. So having that contract tower then interface with the national airspace system, talking to centers and TRACONs and FAA tower facilities, that's all really important. So I think, one, it plays a tremendous role in safety. It plays a tremendous role in enhancing a system of separation and air traffic separation. But I think the challenge is that we have the program is a few years old now, so the towers that first entered that program are aging. They need refurbishment, in some cases replacement. So an investment in that regard, Bill again touches on that, but there's more work to be done. You mentioned the 200+, 260+ towers across the country, so there are pretty vast needs out there for refurbishment, for replacement, for equipment that helps the integration of the controllers and workforce as we discussed earlier.
I agree. The 9 in Kansas, I've not toured all of them, but I've toured quite a few of them, and a lot of them need updated, as the technology continues to change. Second question, and you touched on this, Mr. Kreider, staffing shortages, labor is tight, a lot of parts of the country, Kansas is no exception. Staffing shortages continue to be a challenge throughout the aviation industry, including with contract towers. Do you have any thoughts on how FAA and the industry can work collaboratively to really address staffing challenges at these towers, and what do we need to do to really help improve the situation and to truly move the needle?
Well, I think there's some specifics like we discussed earlier, looking at the labor rates, increasing the pipeline, but whether it's pilots or controllers or maintainers, I think the system, and Mr. Castagna touched on this, it's really a system and a network of labor that's important. And I think communities, one example in San Antonio, what I mentioned in my testimony, we opened a innovation center that invites and brings young people to the airport, a couple hundred yards from Kelly Field, in an environment that introduces them to STEM, STEM and technologies and robotics and cybersecurity and flight simulators, gaming, all the things that are transportable to the skill sets in aviation. And I think that, maybe that's transportable to other communities and other states because at the end of the day, communities and airports have the opportunity to integrate some of the great curriculum, the great touches that we've talked about earlier locally. In our case, Kelly Field has a legacy of being in the ladder to the middle class. So we are really anxious and passionate about getting the thousands of young people and students that come from, frankly, socioeconomically depressed communities through the Innovation Center, get them excited about aerospace, excited about robotics, excited about applied technologies, because our industries that are there on the campus, like Boeing and Standard Air and others, they need that workforce for the future. And so I think that communities can play that role in that workforce pipeline.
I agree. Thank you. Again, y'all for being here, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Mann. The chair now recognizes Mrs. Peltola for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. This has been fun listening to this morning. It seems like the prerequisite to get on the subcommittee is to have logbook hours but no pilot's license. That's the trend I'm seeing here. But I really appreciated your comments, Mr. Baker, and especially your comments in regard to improving weather cams and weather stations in Alaska. Even 20 years ago or 10 years ago, pilots, let's say out of Bethel, would call the village agent to find out what the weather was. And my favorite answer was, "It's good. I can see my four-wheel." So I know agents are being trained to be a lot more specific about like visibility and ceiling and wind direction and all of that. But we're really grateful for the weather cams and weather station improvements. Weather can be fast changing as it is everywhere, but in Alaska, you fly such great distances to get where you're going. I really appreciate how many comments have been made about the dependence Alaskans have on our airfields. But I'm wondering, Mr. Baker, if you could share with us what the committee can do to help these efforts.
Thank you on that question. Yeah, I've flown the great state of Alaska on a float plane every year, and it's a great place to fly, but those weather cameras are critical. And looking into those canyons and understanding if there's a fog bank or rain or moisture, whatever else is going to inhibit your ability to stay VFR flying through that part of Alaska. So we've had some interruptions from time to time where they haven't been able to keep them up. It seems like they're better today than they have been for a while, but it's really critical. We're now starting to take some of that learnings from Alaska and employ those cameras in the lower 48 and some of the Rocky Mountain areas where there is no weather forecasting or broadcasting or no station to do that. So it's one of the areas of funding for the FAA to make sure that they can support that from a safety perspective, and lower routes for Alaska particularly, where the weather is down an awful lot, as we know, and the rain, but they've now just put in some lower routes in the Alaska so you can take a VFR corridor and stay at a very low altitude and know where you're at. So I think the Congress can do between the things we need to get the funding for, like I mentioned before, the hangars and transit ramp spaces and things like that that keep aviation safe and moving, as well as keeping people aware of all the weather things.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Peltola. And the chair now recognizes Mr. D'Esposito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, everyone. It's still morning. I represent the 4th Congressional District on Long Island in New York. My district is just blocks away from JFK Airport, and most of my constituents, if they are flying anywhere, would utilize LaGuardia, JFK, or perhaps MacArthur out in Islip. On January 13th, 2 planes had a close call at JFK Airport. A Delta flight had to abort its takeoff when an American Airlines flight had crossed over into its path from an adjacent taxiway. They were approximately 1,000 feet from one another, which is obviously dangerously close. Thanks to the staff at the tower, the Delta plane was able to cancel their trajectory before any serious damage occurred. A few days later, a JetBlue plane scheduled to depart from JFK bumped into an unoccupied aircraft. The airlines and the FAA say this happened during pushback, which occurs when an aircraft is pushed back from its parked position at the gate before heading toward the tarmac to take flight. Thankfully, no one was hurt. However, these events underscore the importance
of runway safety. Mr. Baker, what additional measure can the FAA do to ensure we have runway safety measures in place at our airports? Because it seems like these issues are happening more often.
Certainly, there's a lot of new players and people in aviation today, and making sure that the training is in place at all of these different activities, whether it be a control tower, whether it be a ramp management. The good news is aviation is growing and booming. The other thing that comes along with that is a lot of new players. in
Understood.
aviation, so reinforcing the training.
Okay, thank you. And what are the AOPA's priorities for the FAA reauthorization that will advance implementing safety measures as well as training?
So, the big things that we believe in safety is the number one thing is keeping low lead fuel available until we have the safe transition to the unleaded fuel. It's the number one priority because we believe we should get rid of low lead fuel, but we need to do it in a safe, meaningful, methodical way, an airport at a time. And to get the funding in place to make sure that that happens is the number one safety issue that we look at for the Congress to give guidance to.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. D'Esposito. The chair now recognizes Mr. Johnson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and I thank the witnesses for your time and attention and for your testimony. While commercial aviation consumes much of our attention, it is general aviation that plays a huge role in providing foundational flight activities such as business travel, humanitarian aid, environmental conservation, and many others. DeKalb Peachtree Airport is in my district in Georgia and has averaged about 228,000 operations per year over the past 30 years. It's the second busiest airport in the state of Georgia in its number of operations, only behind Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. Only 8 miles from the heart of downtown Atlanta, this airport makes it the airport of choice for general aviation operators visiting the Atlanta metropolitan area. I have some questions. Mr. Costanga, you mentioned that there was a huge workforce shortage in aviation. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. We're experiencing workforce shortages from the ramp worker to the pilot community.
And do you find generally that the aviation workforce is underrepresented in terms of people of color and women?
So our position is we believe that a diverse workforce is certainly a resilient workforce. And the efforts that have made in the last few years in working with different groups, the Tuskegee Airmen and the Women in Aviation groups, and bringing more persons of color and women into this aviation industry is certainly important to our organization. I think all of us here at the table feel that that's a critical role. I think it ties to the going back into the schools and into the younger and introducing aviation in all different workforces at all levels and attract them. We were mentioning the air traffic control and what can we do to increase that. Really open the kimono to a bit and introduce the air traffic control world down to those community groups and open them up. Where the FAA had a program that's, I don't think, active now during the pandemic, where you could actually book tours and go visit air traffic control facilities and bring student groups to go see those. Doing that and bringing inner city school kids and bringing kids from high schools to that will certainly open the door of interest.
Okay, thank you. How about you, Mr. Baker, in terms of the pilots? Do you find the same dilemma exists?
Yeah, I'm very excited, though, that our high school initiative, which is about 40% of our young people of color that are taking these classes, STEM education, because they see the career opportunities, and the opportunities have never been richer and better. And 25% young women, which is in a category where we only have 5% of our whole pilots that are women today. So it's really a new opportunity, but you have to bring that to them to show them the pathways exist for them to get onto this program. So that's why it's really critically important we get the support of the NCAA to get this thing rolled out to 2,500 high schools around the country.
Yeah, because, it's a fact that our country is
is becoming more diverse. And if we don't target underrepresented groups, and they may be underrepresented for whatever the reason might be, but if we fail to reach out to try to recruit or try to inspire folks, we're doing ourselves and our industry a disservice. And so I just want to apologize to everyone for sinking into just a small bit of wokeness. I'm so sorry. Now, Mr. Pelton, what impact does limited airport infrastructure funding have on general aviation airports?
I'm probably not the best served to answer that, but the immediate need is if we believe that our 5,000 current general aviation airports are critical to the infrastructure of this country, we need to make sure that we maintain them as we do with our road systems or any other infrastructure. So it's critically important because a lot of these areas, that is a vital link, whether it be for medical services or rescue or other issues. So we should be making equal investments in our 5,000 5,000 public use airports around the country other than the major airports. Otherwise, we're letting our infrastructure deteriorate.
Thank you, and my time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. The chair now recognizes Mr. Kane for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My district starts really 20 minutes away from the Newark Airport and has many other local airports within its boundaries. And I think we all certainly understand that general aviation is the backbone of the United States aviation system, as it contains pilot training, workforce training, and emerging technologies for safe skies. As general aviation supports more than 1.2 million jobs and contributes approximately $128 billion to the United States GDP. On the issue of so many middle-class families in my district and across the country are being impacted by the inflation rate, and when they're sitting around at their dining room tables. But many do not realize that the inflation is hitting the aviation and the aviation construction industry as well. Mr. Kreider, can you please tell us about how inflation and rising construction costs continue to undermine the ability for general aviation airports to complete projects and thus hurting the communities that they're intended to serve?
Absolutely. I think the short answer is that the dollar just doesn't go as far with inflation and frankly, competition. One of the unintended consequences of so much investment in infrastructure is that airports compete with road projects and many other dimensions to get those needed pieces of work done. But I think back to the funding level, if you look at the basic AIP entitlement for general aviation airports, it's been at $150,000 for the last 23 years. So to your point, sir, $150,000 in 23 years ago, what that buys you today is radically reduced. So I think a focus on both changing those formulas, because you have some very large airports. We talked earlier about Peachtree, Kelly Field's another great example. We have large-scale commercial aircraft that operate from those GA airports. Understanding and differentiating how that entitlement and that funding works is important, and then also recognizing that there's both pressure on competition and inflation at play that just doesn't buy you as much as it did a few years ago.
So do you think there, as a follow-up, therefore, do you think that there should be more flexibility in how airports are permitted to use AIP and IIJA funding in recognition of these evolving needs? And specifically, what type of flexibility should this committee consider?
I do. I think, as we talked before about, the regulatory process, getting approval to build projects, but also where those funds are directed, how, relying on airport sponsors to invest those dollars most appropriately. That speaks to eligibility items and frankly, a recognition of facets like industrial airports, infrastructure that supports large job centers and commerce that's essential to our system. I think those are some areas for improvement, but greater flexibility overall, the ability to invest wisely, appropriate to that specific community and airport.
Okay. Thank you, and thank you for the panel for being here today. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Kane. Chair now recognizes Ms. Holmes Norton for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Castagna, as co-chair of the Quiet Skies Caucus, I'm glad you brought up advanced air mobility and the ability of new aircraft design to limit aviation noise. Can you speak more to the benefits of AAM technologies and the necessity of integrating them into the regulatory system of the FAA and the infrastructure of general aviation airports?
Thank you, Congressman. Airports and urban communities are certainly challenged by the continued need to maximize their economic potential and opportunities and workforce development, and at the same time mitigate to the best of their abilities environmental impacts to their neighborhoods, such as noise and other issues. AAM provides a huge opportunity to airports if the infrastructure can be brought in to support the electric aircraft or hydrogen and these new technologies, which are ultimately going to reduce the footprint of noise in these neighborhoods because those aircraft are significantly quieter. So the advent of electric aircraft or hydrogen aircraft and these technologies will have ultimately a direct impact to airport operations, where airports themselves are the natural introduction point for these types of activities, where they ultimately want to establish footholds inside communities off airport. The airport provides the first opportunity for the AAM community to introduce operations into the airspace system.
Thank you. Mr. Baker, in your testimony, you mentioned the need to maintain a qualified workforce in the general aviation sector. You reported that nearly half of AOPA Foundation's curriculum students are students of color and 20% are women. What measures can IOPA and others in general aviation sector are they taking to increase diversity in training and hiring to meet the employment goals of companies like Boeing?
So I believe that the opportunity for the whole industry, and again, under the form of the National Center for the Advancement of Aviation, is getting everybody on the same page. We see lots of young people that want to be in these aviation careers, and we've seen the success of our program, the 9th through the 12th grade, and again, many inner city schools, rural schools, home schools, all kinds of high schools that we are now in 400. I think the opportunity to be in 1 out of every 10, 2,500 high schools in this country is a real opportunity to create that exposure, create the pathways, and get the whole industry working together to solve this problem and create opportunities that have never been better.
Thank you for that response. Mr. Kreider, you mentioned that Port San Antonio has expanded its outreach to recruit students in lower social economic status in order to build up the industry's workforce. How can this recruitment to historically underserved communities, how has this recruitment to underserved communities benefited the maintenance of your workforce?
Well, I think it's been a success. The Innovation Center I described earlier not only introduces young people to careers and opportunities of the future, but it provides a place and a space for industrial aerospace operators to recruit. So we've experienced a variety of internships, hands-on experiences, as well as just direct awareness of opportunities. So it's really connective tissue. The Innovation Center serves as a place to introduce students, but it also allows great organizations like AOPA, EAA, 99s, the Girls Inc., many of those communities that have the diversity that the companies desire, brings them together and allows a recruiting forum so that a pathway to success is established. And that may be internships, that may be exposure, that may be just counsel. So it's really a space where all those things can happen.
Thank you very much. My time has expired.
Thank you, Ms. Holmes-Norton. Chair now recognizes Mrs. Davids.
Thank you, and thank you to our witnesses today for coming in. We've heard a lot about the FAA reauthorization that's coming up, and it's obviously a critical piece of legislation for the entire country, but I definitely appreciate the opportunity to have a discussion about the future of our national airspace and what that might look like. And obviously, we all want the United States to continue to be the gold standard. But we're going to have a challenge. We've heard a little bit about this of constructing things, but also of constructing a bill that is going to promote these innovative technologies that we have, and certainly the businesses that are right here at home that can do that. One of the things that I have been very focused on and was very happy and proud to get to work on in the last session of Congress with now chairman of this subcommittee, Garrett Graves, was the Advanced Air Mobility Coordination and Leadership Act. And we got that across the finish line. It's going to establish an interagency working group to plan and coordinate those efforts. And again, we've heard a bunch about this already, and so I do want to, Mr. Castagna, I know in your written testimony, you talked about NATA's Advanced Air Mobility Committee, and then we heard you, I think when Mr. Stanton was asking about the recommendations that you all might be making. I'm definitely very curious about the, not just the role that your Air Mobility Committee is going to be playing, but how you think we should be integrating and looking at the issues, problems, and then those recommendations, because I think right now with such new technology, it might surprise folks to know that the federal government is not always on the cutting edge of these things. And I would hate to see what happened when drones were really starting to come on the scene to similarly happen with advanced air mobility. So if you want to talk a little bit about that, and then Mr. Kreider, I know you have some comments and thoughts if you want to expand on those, because I know you started talking a little bit about the infrastructure needs that we're going to have going forward.
So thank you. I would just start by saying, so we established the committee since we have existing members that are flying traditional aircraft for charter and other types of activities, where we see there was a nexus between those operators following those same federal guidelines that would apply to the AAM community. So having those two community groups talking to each other and where we could support one another for that integration, we thought was critical. As well, the AAM community needs to work through the certification process for their aircraft, and we know that that's been a challenge just from the traditional aircraft process. We know that they're in that same complicated network, and it's delaying their integration into the airspace. And then lastly, I would just say, for our businesses that are based at the airport, introducing those into the airspace in such a way that we can introduce them to communities and establishing, let's say, arrival and departure procedures and things that are sensitive to an airport's community and can operate safely and efficiently. That's the natural course where we believe it should start. But we ultimately know that AAM wants to branch out beyond the airport boundaries out into communities to operate. But the airport environment provides that first exposure to do so and introduce it safely.
And I would add on a little bit, I think an intentional investment and funding that addresses AAM is prudent. We don't want to be a situation where investment in advanced air mobility reprioritizes or shuffles or subordinates safety projects and other needed projects. but I think an intentional investment in that is important. We're, as I mentioned before, investing in a facility that accommodates AEM in addition to other things, but I think more of that as the vehicles come online, and also an awareness that, you know, it's electric today, but it's going to be, you know, who knows what the future will play.
Thank you. And Mr. Castagna, I probably, I was trying. I probably will want to follow up because I'm running out of time about those certifications, which part the certifications will come under as we look at AAM, and trying to make sure that we're, that this committee and the folks on the T&I committee in general understand what that process is looking like for you all as you're trying to work through it. I know it's through with the FAA, but
Happy to have our staff reach out to you as
Thank
well.
you.
Our sister organization, GAMA, the General Aviation Manufacturers Association. So it's part 23 of the federal process.
okay, thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Davids. Chair now recognizes Mr. Payne for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations on being chosen as chairman of this committee. Mr. Castagna, how was that? That's close. All right. As a co-sponsor of Mr. Larson's Advanced Aviation Infrastructure Modernization Act, I was pleased to read in the testimony of your support of adding electrical vertical takeoff and landing, or EVTOL aircraft into our air system. Is it possible that commercial vertical vehicles service could begin in the next few years under the FAA reauthorization?
So we know that there's a number of participants in the AAM place. There's several hundred in some cases of these manufacturers. We know there's going to be a lot of consolidation in the manufacturing world. But at the top of the pinnacle today of those different companies, some are farther along in their certification process. Some have aspirations to being in the air on the West Coast, where there's a large focus for the Olympics, where they introduced this model for transportation. So to answer your question, I think it's realistically possible. I don't think it will be widespread throughout the country, but I think you'll see it in certain urban markets where they see an opportunity where the connectivity to the urban air mobility for various transportation modes can take place.
Thank you. And in light of this, what priorities should the committee consider that would make this transportation successful and sustainable?
So I think the conformity or consistency in the regulations that exist today that we're operating under for Part 135 and other types of regulations, including the certification, that we apply those standards consistently to those operators so that they're following the same path as our traditional aircraft operations are.
Thank you. Mr. Kreider, are airports ready to add this service? And what else can this committee do to help you add these new aircraft to your operations?
I would say it's a mixed bag. There are some airports that are very aggressive in seeking this new technologies and setting up systems, Kelly Field being one of them, but there are others out there that are anxious to integrate those vehicles into the system. There are others that are waiting to see, so it's definitely a mixed bag. But I think, as Mr. Castagna said, that being ready for that through electrical grid, through standards, through standardization of charging stations, the takeoff and landing processes and procedures, all that standardization and all that pre-work, it's not too early to start. So I think that's the work before us, as it was said here today.
Thank you. And now, Mr. Baker, over the past few years, we've seen a huge increase in the commercial use of unscrewed systems, both remotely and piloted and autonomous. How can this committee help prepare the general aviation pilots
to deal with these new entrants to our airspace?
So we welcome all the new entrants into the airspace. We think it's good for the economy. We think it's good for the technology that we can apply to general aviation as well. One of the things that we feel very strongly about is we don't want to add any more technology into the cockpit of a busy airplane, the most busiest time when you're below 500 feet coming in and going from an airport. So by not allowing any or requiring any mandated more equipment, we already have ADS-B. What we've always done in general aviation is see and avoid or detect and avoid. Those rules still have to apply as we add new entrants to the airspace.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I'm excited. I'm actually going to yield back 32 seconds. Thank you.
Very well done, Mr. Payne. I'm impressed. The chair now recognizes Mr. Carbajal for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll take those extra seconds. I'm kidding. Mr. Kreider, as we move forward with advancements in technology, specifically low and zero emission aircraft and sustainable aviation fuels, SAF, we have an opportunity to decarbonize our skies to make air travel greener. Some of the new developments include full or hybrid electric aircrafts, which the FAA is working to develop a regulatory framework for certification and operation of them. From your perspective, what are the infrastructure needs to promote SAF and the use of hybrid or fully electric aircraft? And do you have any specific recommendations for us as we draft the FAA reauthorization?
I think for the fuels piece, certainly the infrastructure, the fuel systems, being prepared for that transition. Again, not prematurely, but being ready for when the transition takes place. On the electric and the emerging technologies front, electrification is going to be the big thing, especially at commercial airports that are already facing demands for electric charging stations for vehicles, for rental cars, for privately owned vehicles. So that's only amplified by the electric vertical takeoff and landing, which have a fairly high requirement for electricity. So I think capacity in the grid, abilities to charge, compatibility from one aircraft to the other, standards, those are all things that are important next steps and perhaps opportunities for this reauthorization bill to consider.
Thank you. Mr. Kreider, the Airport Improvement Program is a critical source of federal funding for capital airport projects. In your written testimony, you have an extensive list of recommendations to improve that program. One of your recommendations to this committee is that we increase the authorized levels of Airport Improvement Program to $4 billion annually. Can you elaborate on the needs to increase the authorization?
Yes, sir. I think that, recent history has proven that there are many great projects that absorb supplemental appropriations, discretionary appropriations, the bill works. So more work has yet to be done, though. I think we've had a fairly stagnant level of basic AIP for the last few years. So 3.35 billion, I believe, has been the baseline. So increasing to $4 billion, in our opinion, makes great sense in a number of fronts. One of it's recalibration of the formulas, the formula for GA airports, but also medium and large hub airports. So a bit of a recalibration, if you will, that recognizes the different level of investment required at airports of wide variety and a variety of activity levels. So yes, we think $4 billion is certainly warranted in addition to the supplemental appropriations that we've seen in the last few years.
Thank you. Mr. Baker, you have made great points on the impacts of the general aviation industry. It is an economic driver and supports more than 1.2 million jobs. But you also discuss workforce gaps and the need to train the next generation of pilots. How can Congress help support this? And what partnerships can we increase with schools across the country to achieve that goal?
Okay, a couple of those things are important. Thank you again for that question and the point of view. We still believe we've got an opportunity today to make general aviation even better by having transient ramp spots at all these airports. So people can come and go to all these 5,000 public use airports unencumbered by some of the FBO costs that we see today. But we look at the opportunity to grow aviation and bring young people into aviation. I think the NCAA bill, which nearly passed the House last year with 400 votes, should get through today in Congress to support a bigger, broader way of bringing high school education to more than 2,500 high schools, more than 10% of the high schools that exist in this country, giving everybody a pathway and an opportunity to join this great career, aviation.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Are there any further questions from members of the subcommittee who have not been recognized? Seeing none, that concludes our hearing for today. I would like to thank each of the witnesses for your testimony. I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided any answers to questions that may have been submitted to them in writing. Without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. The committee stands adjourned.